15 minutes. That is how long it took a single column of British jeeps to drive onto a German airfield 380 kilometers behind enemy lines and leave 37 Luftwaffe aircraft burning in the sand. 15 minutes from the first muzzle flash to the last jeep turning for the open desert. No artillery preparation, no air support, no second wave. Just 18 stripped-down Willys jeeps moving in a V formation, headlights blazing, twin Vickers K machine guns hammering out 2,400 rounds a minute into the neat lines of parked Junkers, Messerschmitts, and Stukas, sitting wingtip to wingtip under the Egyptian moon. The German officer who emerged from the wreckage the following morning did not know what had hit him. His base commander filed a report that reached Afrika Korps headquarters within hours, and the officer reading it in Derna is said to have put the paper down and asked a question that every senior Axis commander in North Africa was beginning to ask in the summer of 1942. Where are they coming from? And how do we stop them? The answer to that question is the reason the Desert Air Force, the Royal Air Force formation tasked with fighting Rommel for control of the skies, ended up sharing a curious and uncomfortable statistic with the men who would one day call themselves Special Air Service. Over roughly 14 months of operations in the Western Desert between the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1943, a force of British and Commonwealth volunteers that never numbered more than a few dozen active operators in the field destroyed more German and Italian aircraft on the ground than the entire Desert Air Force shot down in the air during the same period. Over 400 aircraft gone, wrecked by sticky bombs, petrol, and rifle rounds, often by men wearing sandals and shorts who had driven across 1,000 miles of sand to get there. This is the story of how a handful of volunteers, initially fewer than 90 men drawn from a disbanded commando force and an experimental desert reconnaissance unit, rewrote the rules of warfare in the Western Desert. It is the story of a founder who could not jump properly, a training officer who invented his own bomb in a tin hut, and an Irish rugby international who once ripped the instrument panel out of a Caproni bomber with his bare hands because he had run out of explosives. It is the story of the Long-Range Desert Group, the taxi drivers of the Libyan sand seas, whose sun compasses and pink-painted Chevrolets delivered the raiders to airfields the Luftwaffe believed were geographically unreachable. And it is the story of how all of it began in a canvas tent at Cabrit, on the banks of the Great Bitter Lake, in the summer of 1941. To understand what these men achieved, you have to understand what the Western Desert looked like to the British High Command in the months after Dunkirk. The Mediterranean was a battlefield of convoys. Malta was under siege. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander who would be nicknamed the Desert Fox, had arrived in Tripoli in February 1941 at the head of the Afrika Korps. Within weeks, his panzer columns had reversed every British gain of the previous year. Benghazi fell. Tobruk was besieged. The 8th Army, a patchwork formation of British, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian units, was pushed back toward the Egyptian border. The men supplying Rommel and the men opposing him were, in a strange way, fighting the same enemy. The desert. The Libyan and Egyptian interior was one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Daytime temperatures in summer exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Water, when it was found, often lay below 30 meters of limestone. The great sand seas of Calancio and the Grand Urg covered territory the size of Ireland, with dunes reaching 200 meters high. The nearest metalled road to anywhere worth raiding ran along the coastal strip called the Via Balbia, and that road was watched, patrolled, and intermittently bombed. The rest of Libya, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of rock, gravel, and sand, was assumed by both sides to be militarily impassable. That assumption was wrong. It was wrong because of a 45-year-old British officer named Ralph Bagnold. Bagnold was not a soldier in the conventional sense. Before the war, he had been a Royal Engineer, an expedition leader, and the author of a landmark scientific treatise titled The Physics of Blown Sand and Desert Dunes, a book still cited by NASA researchers studying dunes on Mars. Through the 1920s and 1930s, he had spent his leave driving Chevrolet trucks across the Libyan desert, mapping routes every professional geographer insisted did not exist. He had invented the sun compass, a device that, unlike a magnetic compass, functioned reliably inside a metal vehicle. He knew the precise tire pressures for soft sand. He knew where the wells were. He knew how to keep an engine alive in an environment that tried to kill it with heat by day and freezing winds by night. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, Bagnold walked into General Archibald Wavell's headquarters in Cairo and proposed something that every staff officer present regarded as lunatic. He wanted to raise a unit of volunteers, equip them with modified civilian trucks, and send them on reconnaissance patrols 1,500 kilometers deep into Italian-held Libya. Wavell, to his eternal credit, did not laugh. He asked Bagnold how long he needed. Bagnold said 6 weeks. He was ready in 5. The Long Range Desert Group, as the unit was officially designated in the summer of 1940, began with a corps of 150 New Zealanders recruited not for their combat experience, but for their mechanical aptitude. Bagnold wanted farmers, men who could strip a gearbox in the field and reassemble it using washers cut from a bully beef tin. He chose Chevrolet 30 hundredweight trucks because they had proved durable in his pre-war expeditions, stripped them of every unnecessary fitting, added sand tires, camouflage paint in rose pink and olive green, spare water tanks, extra fuel jerrycans, and in most cases, twin Vickers K aircraft machine guns scavenged from Royal Air Force stocks. The Vickers K fired 1,200 rounds per minute. 2 of them mounted together delivered a volume of fire that no German or Italian patrol vehicle could match. By early 1941, the Long Range Desert Group was operating at distances that the Axis planning staff in Rome considered impossible. A single patrol, typically 5 or 6 trucks and 18 to 25 men, could cover 2,500 kilometers on a single mission, watching the coast road for weeks at a time from hides dug into the gravel ridges of the escarpment, then driving out across the sand seas to reappear in Cairo with logbooks full of enemy convoy movements. The Germans called them the Ghost Patrol. The Italians, who bore the brunt of early LRDG operations, called them something less printable. Bagnold himself, with characteristic modesty, described the unit's purpose as piracy on the high desert. It was into this world that Archibald David Stirling arrived in June 1941, hospitalized, frustrated, and in possession of an idea that would change the history of special operations. Stirling was 25 years old, a lieutenant in the Scots Guards, and by every reasonable measure, a disappointing soldier. He was 6'5", known in his family as the Phantom for his habit of disappearing on hunting trips in the Scottish Highlands, and had arrived in Egypt with Lay Force, the commando formation commanded by Colonel Robert Laycock. Lay Force had achieved almost nothing. Its planned operations had been canceled, its personnel scattered across the Middle East, and by the early summer of 1941, the War Office had decided to disband it. Stirling had been on a practice parachute jump when his canopy caught on the aircraft's tail fin, tearing panels out of the silk and dropping him onto the desert floor with enough force to paralyze his legs for weeks. He was still on crutches when he wrote the memorandum. The argument was simple, almost insultingly so. The coastal airfields supplying Rommel's Luftflotte II were protected against conventional attack by their distance from the Allied front line and by air defenses oriented toward the sea. They were not protected against small teams arriving from the landward side out of the deep desert, on foot or in stripped-down vehicles, at night. A parachute raid with the right explosives, delivered by the right men, could destroy more aircraft in a single operation than a whole squadron of fighters could shoot down in a month. Stirling could not get past the headquarters sentries to deliver the memorandum through official channels, so he hobbled in through a side gate on his crutches, blagged his way past a protesting clerk, and walked directly into the office of General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff. Ritchie read the memo in silence, passed it up to General Claude Auchinleck, the new Commander-in-Chief Middle East, and within a fortnight, Sterling had his authorization. The unit would be called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. There was no SAS Brigade. The name was a deliberate deception invented to reinforce an existing Middle East counterintelligence operation called K Detachment, which had been planting rumors of a phantom British airborne division in the region. The Germans, who monitored Allied order of battle changes obsessively, were meant to conclude that a large parachute force had arrived in Egypt. In reality, Sterling had 5 officers and 60 other ranks. 65 men, most of them recruited from the disbanding Lay Force, quartered in a canvas tent camp at Kabrit, 100 miles south of Cairo, next to an RAF parachute training school that did not want them there. They had no parachutes. They had no trucks. They had almost no rations. Sterling's first unofficial operation was a night raid on a nearby New Zealand division camp to steal tents, beds, cooking equipment, and a 3-ton lorry, all of which arrived at Kabrit the following morning, stenciled in fresh white paint with the letters LDETSAS Brigade. The cheek became regimental legend. It also, arguably, saved the unit, because without that stolen kit, there would have been nothing to train with. The training was supervised by a man whose name today is spoken in Hereford with the reverence other regiments reserve for their founders. John Steele Lewis, universally known as Jock, was 27 years old, an Australian-raised Welsh Guards officer, former president of the Oxford University Boat Club, and one of those rare human beings who combined physical endurance, mathematical precision, and a streak of absolute moral fanaticism. David Sterling, reflecting years after the war, said that Jock Lewis could far more genuinely claim to be the founder of the SAS than I. Lewis designed the training program at Kabrit from first principles, drawing on what he had learned from months of commando operations around Tobruk and from weeks of reading German and Italian parachute doctrine, translated by intelligence corps linguists in Cairo. The standards were brutal. Recruits were expected to march 50 miles across open desert in under 18 hours, carrying rifle, ammunition, 3 water bottles, and enough rations for the round trip. They were expected to navigate by compass bearings at night across terrain with no landmarks. They practiced parachute landings by jumping off the tailgates of lorries driven at 30 miles per hour. They learned to strip and rebuild a Vickers machine gun blindfolded, to set and disarm booby traps, and to perform basic field surgery on each other because the detachment had no medical officer. When 2 recruits, Ken Warburton and Joe Duffy, were killed during the unit's first live parachute descents on October 17, 1941, after their static lines failed, Lewis personally inspected the faulty equipment, modified the hook attachments, and jumped first himself the next morning, followed by Sterling, to prove the repair. Every remaining recruit then jumped in turn. Nobody refused. Lewis's second contribution, the one that made the destruction of 400 aircraft mathematically possible, was the invention of a bomb. The standard British demolition charge in 1941 was a half-pound slab of gun cotton with a separate incendiary initiator, far too heavy and too bulky for a parachutist trying to attack 20 aircraft with a load he could carry on his back. Lewis set up a workshop in a tin shed at Kabrit and began experimenting. He mixed Noble 808 plastic explosive, a nitroglycerin-based British military charge, with a smell that gave users such violent headaches that handlers had to be rotated every hour. He added diesel oil for sustained incendiary effect. He bound the mixture around a thermite initiator wrapped in gelinite. He wrapped the whole package in a cotton bandage soaked in old sump oil, then dipped it in sand to disguise the shape. The result, christened the Lewis bomb by the men who would carry hundreds of them into action, weighed approximately 1 pound. It was small enough that an SAS trooper could carry 30 of them in a canvas haversack. It was sticky enough to be pressed onto the wing root of a parked aircraft directly above the fuel tank. Once its pencil detonator activated, usually 30 minutes after the timer pin was pulled, the charge would punch a hole through the aluminum skin, ignite the fuel in the wing tank, and turn the aircraft into a 10-meter fireball. A single Lewis bomb destroyed a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka as completely as a direct hit from a 250-kilogram aerial bomb, and the SAS could place one every 15 seconds, aircraft after aircraft, for as long as the moonlight and the enemy's confusion allowed. When Italian engineers later recovered unexploded Lewis bombs from an SAS raid site and tested them on condemned aircraft, their after-action report noted, with what one translator described as schoolboy enthusiasm, that every single test detonation not only destroyed the aircraft, but set the fuel alight. They had never seen a charge this efficient. They had no idea how to counter it. By November 1941, the fledgling detachment was ready. Sterling pitched Operation Squatter to 8th Army Headquarters as the opening act of Operation Crusader, the British offensive that would attempt to relieve the garrison of Tobruk. The plan was for 5 sticks of 11 men each to parachute at night into the desert south of the coastal strip, march to 5 forward Luftwaffe airfields around Gazala and Tamimi, and destroy the hundreds of aircraft parked there. Sterling commanded 1 stick, Jock Lewis another. Paddy Mayne, a hard-drinking former Irish international rugby player who had joined the unit from No. 11 Scottish Commando under circumstances that varied depending on who told the story, commanded a third. The operation was launched on the night of November 16, 1941, into one of the worst storms to hit the western desert in a decade. Wind speeds at the drop zone exceeded 45 knots. The pilots of the 5 Bristol-Bombay transport aircraft could not find their beacons. Parachutes deployed into 60 km/h gusts that dragged men for hundreds of meters across rock and thorn scrub. Some of the sticks landed 30 kilometers from their intended drop zones. Most of the demolition material, soaked in the sudden rain and battered by the landings, was unusable. Of the 55 men who jumped, only 22 returned to the long-range desert group rendezvous points. The rest were killed, captured, or simply vanished into the desert. 0 enemy aircraft were destroyed. A lesser officer would have been sacked. A lesser unit would have been disbanded. But something unusual happened at 8th Army Headquarters during those weeks. Crusader itself was going badly. Tobruk still held, but Rommel was counterattacking. The generals had bigger problems than one failed raid by 65 volunteers. Sterling was allowed to try again, and this time he took the lesson of squatter and threw away the parachute plan entirely. If the desert was the problem, the desert would be the solution. He would ride to the targets in long-range desert group trucks. That partnership, forged in the winter of 1941 and deepened across the following year, is the tactical engine that made everything that came afterward possible. The long-range desert group called themselves, with affectionate mockery, the Libyan Desert Taxi Service. The SAS were the paying passengers. Jack Mann, one of the last surviving members of the LRDG, recalled the relationship simply. "We were the taxi service because we could take you anywhere. We knew the desert." The numbers are worth sitting with. A typical combined SAS-LRDG insertion in December 1941 involved 2 LRDG patrols, perhaps 20 men and 10 trucks, escorting 2 SAS raiding parties of 5 to 8 operators each. The round trip from the oasis at Jalo, the LRDG's forward base inside Libya, to a target like Sirte or Wadi Tamet on the coast could exceed 1,000 kilometers. The trucks carried 700 liters of petrol, 200 liters of water, rations for 3 weeks, ammunition for the Vickers K guns, and the SAS raiding party with their Lewis bombs, Thompson submachine guns, and personal equipment. They navigated by sun compass, theodolite, and the stars. They traveled only at dawn and dusk to avoid aerial detection, lying under camouflage nets during the hottest hours of the day. On the night of December 14, 1941, the partnership detonated into one of the most extraordinary sequences of small unit operations in military history. 3 separate SAS parties, delivered by LRDG trucks to their final march-off points, attacked 3 airfields simultaneously. Jock Lewis led his team against El Agheila. Bill Fraser led his against Ajdabiya. And Paddy Mayne, with 7 men, walked through the perimeter wire at Wadi Tamat Airfield at approximately 2140 hours, pushed open the door of the officers' mess, and in a moment that has passed into the mythology of the regiment, fired an entire 50-round drum from his Thompson submachine gun into the room. The surviving Italian and German aircrew fled into the desert. Mayne and his men then moved methodically down the flight line, attaching Lewis bombs to 24 aircraft, a line of telegraph poles, a fuel dump, and an ammunition store. Then Mayne did something that nobody who knew him ever forgot. He ran out of Lewis bombs before he ran out of aircraft. Rather than leave an operational bomber intact, he climbed into the cockpit, found the instrument panel, and with hands that had once locked an opponent in a 5-nation scrum, physically tore the controls out of the bulkhead and hurled them into the sand. The aircraft was effectively destroyed. In his official report logged at headquarters in Cairo on his return, Mayne wrote, in the understated language of the Ulster Protestant tradition he had been raised in, that 10 planes had their instrument panels damaged. The prose does not quite capture what happened. Mayne's team withdrew without a single casualty. Fraser's team at Ajdabiya destroyed 37 aircraft. Lewis at El Agheila was frustrated by a heavily guarded perimeter and caused only moderate damage, but by the rendezvous with the LRDG on the evening of December 15th, the detachment had accounted for approximately 60 Axis aircraft across 3 airfields in a single night, at a cost of nothing. No SAS operator was killed in the raid. Rommel's staff did not, at first, understand what had happened. German intelligence estimates suggested that a British armored column must have broken through the front and somehow reached the coastal airfields, although no such column was visible on reconnaissance photographs. The Luftwaffe, reasonably, dispersed aircraft from forward fields to deeper rear bases. Within 10 days, the SAS came for them there too. On the night of December 27, 1941, Mayne led a party back to Wadi Tamat, correctly guessing that the Germans would have repopulated the field in the belief that no second raid would hit the same target so soon. He destroyed a further 27 aircraft, along with 3 trucks and 2 trailers crammed with aircraft spare parts. In the space of 13 days, one 5-man team under one Ulster-born rugby player had accounted for 51 enemy aircraft on a single coastal airstrip. The cost, as always, came for those it came for. On December 30, 1941, returning from a raid on Nophelia, Jock Lewis was machine-gunned by a low-flying Italian fighter as his LRDG truck tried to reach the cover of the escarpment. He was hit in the thigh. The femoral artery was severed. He bled to death in the back of the truck within 4 minutes of being hit. His body, buried hastily by his surviving comrades in a shallow grave somewhere along the track to JLO, has never been found. The man who designed the training program, the man who invented the bomb, the man who, above any other single individual, shaped what the SAS would become in the decades to follow, had been a serving officer of the detachment for 17 weeks. Sterling wrote to Lewis's father that a better officer never lived. It was not a platitude. In 2015, Prince William, Duke of Cambridge, unveiled a bronze statue of Jock Lewis at the Special Air Service Regimental Headquarters at Credenhill. It is one of only 2 such statues on the site. The war did not pause for grief. Through the first half of 1942, the SAS, reinforced by new recruits drawn from lay force remnants and later from a free French detachment under Commandant Georges Berger, continued to operate in concert with the LRDG across every Axis airfield they could reach. A January 1942 raid on Burat caused severe damage to petrol storage. A March raid at Burqa destroyed 15 aircraft. The June raids on Crete, flown in by submarine and attacked by SAS and Special Boat Section parties under Berger and Captain George Jellicoe, destroyed approximately 20 Junkers Ju-88s at Heraklion alone, at heavy cost in French casualties. A joint SAS-LRDG raid at Fuka and Mersa Matruh in July 1942 destroyed 30 more aircraft, including several of the precious Bf-109 fighters that Rommel relied on for air cover during his pursuit of the Eighth Army toward Alexandria. And then, on the night of July 26, 1942, Sterling launched the operation that, more than any other, demonstrated what the unit had become. The target was Sidi Haneish, a Luftwaffe airfield 235 kilometers west of Cairo, being used by Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft to ferry supplies and reinforcements to the Panzer Army Africa. Sterling had in the preceding weeks acquired his own transport. 18 American-built Willys MB Jeeps, stripped of their windscreens and spare tires, fitted with sand channels and additional fuel tanks, and armed with a weapon that transformed the tactical problem of airfield assault entirely. Twin Vickers K machine guns, mounted on a pillar gimbal in front of the passenger seat, with a second pair sometimes mounted over the rear axle. 4 machine guns per Jeep, 18 Jeeps, 72 machine guns. A combined rate of fire that, in one 30-second burst, could put more lead over a target than a cruiser's forward armament. The weather on the night of July 26th was ideal. Full moon, no cloud. The 18 Jeeps, carrying 42 operators, plus drivers and gunners, navigated by compass through the final 60 kilometers of desert and formed up in a V shape, Sterling in the lead Jeep, with Mike Sadler, his legendary navigator, beside him. As they approached the airfield perimeter, the runway lights suddenly came on. The SAS drivers froze. For a heart-stopping moment, they believed they had been detected and that the lights were part of a trap. They had not been. A Luftwaffe bomber was returning late from a sortie, and the ground controller had lit the runway for its landing. Sterling, in the coolest improvisation of his career, fired a green flare. The V formation accelerated onto the airfield. What happened over the next 15 minutes is documented in the official after-action report filed in Cairo and in the surviving personal diaries of several participants. The Jeeps drove directly along the flight line, 20 meters from the parked aircraft, gunners hammering tracer into wing tanks, engine cowlings, and cockpits. Stukas caught fire and exploded. Junkers transports collapsed onto their undercarriage as wing tanks detonated beneath them. Messerschmitt fighters burned on their revetments. German ground crew who tried to reach anti-aircraft positions were cut down by the rear gunners. Paddy Mayne, riding in the second Jeep of the formation, ran out of machine gun ammunition halfway through the attack, dismounted, walked to a still intact bomber at the end of the flight line, climbed onto the wing, and placed a Lewis bomb in the engine nacelle by hand. One Allied soldier, Lance Bombardier John Robson, was killed when a German gunner opened up on the retreating column. He was the only SAS fatality of the entire operation. 37 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed or damaged. 15 minutes. 42 men. No conventional measure of combat power exists that can rationalize this ratio. At the speed of World War II air superiority combat, 37 aircraft represented the combined strength of 2 full RAF fighter squadrons. The SAS had accomplished in a quarter of an hour what a sustained air campaign against the same airfield would have required weeks to achieve. The survivors withdrew into the desert before dawn, scattering into small groups to evade the inevitable German air search, and all but one party reached the safe assembly point at Bir el Qusayr. The rest of the force returned to the LRDG rear base at Kufra to reload, refit, and plan the next raid. By this point, the cumulative impact of the campaign on the Axis order of battle was becoming impossible to hide. Rommel's diaries, recovered after the war, contain increasingly frustrated references to supply aircraft being destroyed before they could even fly a mission. The Luftwaffe was forced to disperse its forward squadrons across multiple secondary airstrips, a dispersal that degraded serviceability and reduced the number of sorties flown per day. Italian air reinforcements arriving in Tripoli were being lost to SAS ground attack before their pilots had even reached the combat zone. The figure most commonly cited, confirmed by multiple post-war sources, including the Special Air Service Regimental Association, is that by the end of active operations in North Africa in early 1943, the SAS had destroyed and put out of action over 400 enemy aircraft. Paddy Mayne's personal tally was more than 100 aircraft, a score greater than any Allied fighter ace of the entire war, and he was credited with it while never once sitting in a cockpit himself. The LRDG, the taxi service without which none of it would have been possible, carried their passengers for the last time in September 1942. During Operation Caravan, a diversionary raid supporting the disastrous main assault on Tobruk, T-1 and G-1 patrols covered 1,858 kilometers from their Egyptian base at Fayoum to attack the Italian airfield at Bars. Deep behind the front line, at a distance most staff officers would have considered suicidal. 47 men, 12 trucks, 5 jeeps. They reached Bars on September 13th, split into 2 parties, attacked the airfield and the barracks simultaneously, and destroyed between 16 and 35 Italian aircraft, depending on whether one accepts the LRDG after-action report, the Italian official figures, or the Italian prisoner of war testimony. Even the lowest estimate made it the only successful operation of the entire multi-pronged raid that night. The withdrawal was savaged by Italian fighters the following day. 10 of the 12 trucks were destroyed. Many of the survivors walked out on foot, covering 160 kilometers across broken ground, without water, navigating by the stars and by memory of Bagnold's old expedition maps. David Sterling was captured in January 1943 during an operation in southern Tunisia, hunted down in a wadi by a specially trained German counter-SAS unit, formed specifically in response to the damage the unit had caused. He spent the rest of the war in a succession of prisoner of war camps before being transferred to Colditz Castle, and was awarded an OBE for his conduct. Paddy Mayne, promoted to take over command, went on to lead the Special Raiding Squadron in Sicily and Italy, returned to the revived SAS Brigade for the Normandy campaign, and by the war's end had received 4 Distinguished Service Orders, a level of decoration that led King George VI himself to remark that the Victoria Cross so strangely eluded him. Mayne died in a car accident in Newtownards in December 1955, aged 40. What the 87 volunteers of the early SAS and their long-range Desert Group comrades had proved in those 14 months between Operation Squatter and the armistice in North Africa was a principle that has governed special operations theory ever since. A small number of supremely trained men, equipped with the right weapon, delivered to the right place by people who understood the terrain better than the enemy did, could achieve effects in an order of magnitude disproportionate to their cost. One Lewis bomb, properly placed, destroyed 1 aircraft. 30 bombs in a haversack destroyed a squadron. 37 aircraft lost in 15 minutes shattered the operational tempo of a theater-level Air Force. The Desert Air Force, for all its Spitfires and Hurricanes and Kitty Hawks, fought a different war, a war of patrol and interception and air-to-air combat, measured in kill rings painted on fighter fuselages and in the daily bulletins read out by Cairo radio. It was necessary work. It was hard work. It was not pound for pound anything like as efficient a means of killing German and Italian aircraft as driving a pink Chevrolet 1,500 kilometers through a sand sea, unloading a party of men wearing shorts and sandals, and letting them walk onto the airfield at 3 in the morning with a haversack of sticky bombs. This is why the statistic endures. 400 aircraft on the ground, more than the Desert Air Force shot down in the air. Most of them wrecked by a corps of fewer than 90 men who at the beginning had no parachutes, no trucks, no bombs that worked, no medical officer, and no military reason to believe any of what they proposed was remotely possible. They made it possible anyway. They made it possible because Bagnold had spent 15 years between the wars driving an unmilitary curiosity across unmapped sand. Because Sterling had nothing better to do with his crutches than walk into a general's office uninvited. Because Jock Lewis understood the chemistry of diesel, thermite, and Nobel 808 well enough to invent a bomb the Italian engineers could not duplicate. Because Paddy Mayne was a man whose physical and tactical aggression operated on a scale that conventional military structures could barely contain. And because a handful of New Zealand farmers in 30 hundredweight trucks carrying sun compasses designed on a mahogany workbench in Cairo could find a specific Libyan airfield on a specific night to within 100 meters, without radar, without GPS, without any of the apparatus that modern warfare considers indispensable. They were, to use a phrase that would attach itself to the regiment in the decades that followed, madmen in trucks. The Germans thought so. The Italians thought so. A great many senior British officers at Middle East headquarters, right up to the point at which the results became undeniable, thought so. But the desert did not care what anyone thought. The desert only cared whether you could cross it, find water, keep your engine running and your tires inflated, and whether, at the end of 1,000 miles of sand, you could do something useful when you arrived. 87 volunteers could. They carried sticky bombs and haversacks and sun compasses bolted to dashboards. They navigated by theodolite and star sights, and they arrived, night after night, at the precise Libyan airfield they had set out for, regardless of whether the Luftwaffe believed such an arrival was geographically possible. They out-hunted an entire enemy air force while doing it. When the North African campaign ended in May 1943, when Axis forces surrendered in Tunisia, the ledger stood at over 400 aircraft destroyed on the ground by a unit that, at its conception, had been 65 men in a tent at Cabrit with a stolen typewriter and a ridiculous idea. That ledger has never been matched. Which is why every time a new generation of recruits walks onto the selection course at Hereford and learns the regimental history, they are told the same thing Sterling told the survivors of Operation Squatter when they assembled in the mess tent at Cabrit to be told they were still in business. Who dares wins. It was never meant as a motto. It was meant to describe what had actually happened in the desert.